Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Happy Monday and happy March, if you can believe it already. We are moving quickly through the start of 2022. It's a pleasure to have you joining us at our SAS 5PO4 Transdisciplinary Seminar. And this morning, we are so pleased to welcome Dr. Ana Carolina Estevez Diaz, joining us from Waterloo. In the office, which is a really nice sign that we're slowly transitioning back to being in person. So just before I hand over the floor, let me introduce Dr. Estevez Diaz's work more formally. So Ana Carolina is a postdoctoral fellow for the V2V, or Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership Initiative, out of the University of Waterloo, and also an adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo. Her research focuses on understanding global and regional vulnerabilities faced by small-scale fisheries and supporting knowledge to foster a transition towards more viable small-scale fisheries communities. Her expertise relies on coastal governance, fisheries monitoring, and the relationship between the well-being of fishing communities with a focus on developing countries. She holds a PhD in Social and Ecological Sustainability from the University of Waterloo and an M.Sc in Ecology from the University of Campinas in Brazil. Ana Carolina is the co-founder of the Social Ecological Co-Creation Network for Latin America, which is oriented to develop co-creation methodologies to respond to social and ecological challenges. She collaborates with the Research and Outreach Group on Conservation and Management of the Commons, the University of Campinas, and is a past institutional fellow at the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research. So it's such a pleasure to have you join us this morning. I'm really looking forward to your talk, and a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'm very happy to be here as well. I worked with Jessica some time ago in a project that I'll present a little bit for you today on the links between ecosystem services and well-being of coastal communities. And it's been really nice to see how this project has developed. It was a bit part of my PhD thesis as well, and now jump into this idea of vulnerability to viability, this transition in fishing communities that has a lot related to the dynamics of coastal ecosystems and social well-being. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Jessica, for the kind introduction. And today we'll talk about a little bit of that interplay between coastal ecosystems and people's well-being. To give you a brief overview of the talk, we'll talk a little bit about the background on ecosystem services, social well-being literature, draw these connections between how ecosystems, and more specifically coastal ecosystems, can provide well-being to people in different dimensions, material well-being, but also social and subjective dimensions of well-being. And I'll present a case study on a coastal community in Brazil that is connected to fisheries, tourism, and other sorts of livelihoods, but to grasp these ideas on the ground on how coastal ecosystems provide well-being to people in different ways and can support the transition from vulnerable to viable communities in the coastal setting. So here, this is a photo of a type of fishing that is a traditional type of fishing back in Brazil. And fishers, they go out in the sea, they put the net, and the net is like a wall in the water column. And then the fish, they go in and they stay swimming there, they stay alive. And then they come in two different small boats or two different canoes to grab the net. And then you can see that the fish, they still come alive, and if there is any other animals they can release. For example, here there is a ray that they can just take the ray out. The ray is still alive and was free in the water column. And something that is very interesting once you talk to those fishermen is that they really enjoy the process of fishing, and this is a lot of interaction between people in the fishing. So they are usually really good friends, or they're a family, and they need to work and collaborate together in order to have a successful fishing. And this is one aspect of well-being that we'll talk a little bit more in the fishing sector as well. And after they go out fishing, each one that participates in the fishing has their own share from the fishing. And this is a very interesting dynamics on how these things happen on the ground. And this is a lot of demand, is a demanding work as well, because they are subjected to different vulnerabilities, for example, to climate change that might affect um, fish stocks, but also affect the safety at sea if you have big waves as a resultant from any changes in natural cycles. All these are related to some of vulnerabilities. They need to rely on their own physical health to go out fishing, so all these things can bring some vulnerabilities to the activity, but they also rely on small-scale fisheries for their income, source of food, social interaction, the perception of self and identity, and cultural identity is something that is very strong in these communities. So this photo is to draw like a big picture of small-scale fisheries and the connections between coastal ecosystems and well-being, and this very dynamic process where you have um, the social dynamics related to how one person see him or herself, related to family dynamics, related to material needs. So these are themes that we're going to explore in the talk today. And here, the idea is to visualize this vulnerability to viability transition through the lens of well-being and ecosystem services bundles, that we'll talk a little bit more how different aspects and dimensions of well-being are really connected to some of the ecosystems and ecosystem services in the economic domain, but also in the social, cultural domains, and the ecological domains, and how all these things are put together in the governance process and management of fisheries and of coastal areas as well. And we have some emergent issues that are also connected to vulnerability and viability of fishing communities and very connected to their well-being. And we can take an example of the COVID-19 pandemic that was a vulnerability that caused different types of detrimental outputs to fishing, as for example, if the lockdowns, fishers couldn't go out and fish, and that had serious implications to their sources of food and income. But on the other hand, in some cases, for example, in Japan, there was this group of people that they started, once they go out fishing, they didn't have the middleman anymore, so that they develop an application to connect them to direct consumers. So because of that, they had a better input or a better income from their fisheries. And this was something that was related to, once you have a vulnerability, how to deal with that to make it more viable. So it was, these are some interesting cases that you can think about, how to navigate this vulnerability viability in coastal settings. And once you go back to the term ecosystem services, this is a very controversial term, but at the same time, it was bringing the research and the relevance of nature and nature's connections to people's well-being to the decision-making and policy-making discourse. So this term was coined in the 80s, and it was developed throughout the years to bring this connection between how people are dependent on nature and how can you make that as an idea relevant to decision makers in coastal governance, and how we can integrate research bodies with some of the decisions that are being made in respect to coastal environments and people living in the coast. And this was developed through the lens, a lot through the lens of the economic perspective. So there was development of payment for ecosystem services, economic evaluation of services. So how can we put a value on nature, economic value on nature, to make us think about how much we depend on nature, how much we need to address the conservation, but also to understand how different sources of economic activities are dependent on healthy environments. And this was developed throughout the years to incorporate different dimensions of well-being, not only economic, not only um, natural, but also how this connects to the well-being of people in different dimensions, how coastal environments are also part of social relations of communities that live by the coast, as well as how this is part of the identity that oneself builds, and how someone perceives him or herself, how someone perceives their goals, their culture, and all this are also being incorporated into the ecosystem services literature, research, and practice. And we have also this very nice integration between policy and science. that are reports started from Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and now we also have the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that is the IPBS. And these are reports that we can say they're equivalent to the IPCC for climate change, and they are focused on biodiversity and ecosystem services, or this interplay between people and ecosystems. And these reports also talk about how the coastal ecosystems, or ecosystems in general, but here the focus is coastal ecosystems, are very important for people in different ways. And to broaden that perspective from economic to a more social perspective, or more holistic perspective, that nature also contributes to people's identity, cultural identity, social relations, the IPBS came with this idea that we're talking about services, ecosystem services, but is that the case that ecosystems or coastal ecosystems just bring us services? This is a very anthropogenic point of view. So they bring this term that nature's contribution to people. So what are the different contributions that nature can bring to people? And it's not only people using nature for their own sake, but it's more like how does interplay, because we are part of nature. So how these connections happen, and how can we benefit them as society, and having a more holistic perspective of these connections. So then some input from social sciences into the ecosystem services scholarship is being developed a lot in theory, and things about how can we incorporate that into practice is something that we still need to develop. And these are some of the core critiques of the ecosystem services literature, this anthropogenic view that is being addressed, for example, by the IPBS initiative, oversimplification of nature and human relationships that bring us what are some of the trade-offs, what are some of the linkages that are missed, that incorporate cultural dimensions, that incorporate how people interact with themselves and how people feel good being part of nature. And low input from social sciences beyond economics. That is something that we are trying to address, bringing more the social well-being perspective that is being incorporated throughout the years. And we're now trying to identify some nuances of these connections between systems and people in different ways. What are their motivations, their needs, their uses, and how that happens in different settings. And this is being incorporated through different frameworks. For example, the Millennium Assessment started with a nice framework on how ecosystem services, they connect with different dimensions of well-being, security, health, good relations. And then the IPBS was developing a little bit more the social part of that. So we are talking about these connections, but from the lens of whom? So we have the scientific knowledge, we have the practitioner as knowledge, we have local knowledge of those people, empirical knowledge of people that are being there, incorporating, integrating, interacting with ecosystems themselves. So how can we understand that in different perspectives? And we have other frameworks that talk about how can we incorporate the different um, types or classifications of ecosystem services to broader perspectives of well-being. What are some other dimensions of well-being that are more connected to people's ideas of social relations, of cultural aspects, identity issues, and these are some of the work that is being developed. And I'll talk a little bit about the social well-being concept and how that helps us to identify a little bit more the nuances of human nature relationships. And I'll give some examples on the coastal areas and fishing communities as well. So social well-being can be understood as a state of being with others, which arises where human needs are met, where one can act meaningfully to pursue one's goals, and where one can enjoy a satisfactory quality of life. So these, how coastal ecosystems play a role in people interacting with other people's goals and perspectives for a good quality of life. And this can happen in different ways. The material way, that is definitely very important. Stable source of income, source of food, to keep the basic standards of life. This is important, but we also have the relational aspect. So how fishing or how living by the coast mediate the social relations of people that also live by the coast, but also with decision makers and other people that are interacting in the coastal governance. And the subjective dimensions that are connected to values, perceptions, or experiences that people have that may be related to sacred beliefs, may be related to the concept of self, the development of someone's personality that was born and raised, for example, in the fishing sector, cultural identity, level of satisfaction of life as well. So here is just a quick example that fisheries, they are related to the standards of living, material well-being, source of food and income, but also has a very strong component of social identity. So fishers understand themselves as fishers, as coming from a fishing family, and even in areas where they could have a different source of livelihood that might bring them more or better income perspectives, they still consider fisheries as a very important for their identity. And also subjective identity as well as social identity within a fishing community. And also satisfaction to go out fishing. This is something that brings them peace of mind, that brings them a connection to something else that is very important as well in the coastal zones. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the case study. And there are also some aspects of well-being and ecosystem services that they are tightly connected, and we call them bundles. So this is the idea of bundles. So what are some of the services or dimensions of well-being that are strong connected one another? So some strong dependencies of well-being to a specific set of ecosystem services, and the dependence of conservation of ecosystem services that are based on their contributions and values to people. So this is an interactive process where ecosystems provide benefit to people and people's well-being. Once we recognize those benefits, we also will provide ways, or will be willing to collaborate in ways to preserve those ecosystems and therefore preserving the benefits that people gain from them. And this is the idea of WEBs, their well-being ecosystem services bundles. What are the set of ecosystem services that are tightly associated with improvements in social well-being of a given community? This can be very place-based and contextualized. The specifics of what type of ecosystem services are connected to what type of well-being, but this idea is more generalized, where you have ecosystem services that are linked and provides you well-being from material perspective or relational perspective or subjective perspective, and this is something that you can find in different places. And understanding this, how ecosystem services connect to well-being in a broader sense, also help with this transition from vulnerability to viability, because you can try to identify what are some of the major efforts in governance and management that we can put to make sure that ecosystem benefits will keep flowing and provide well-being to people. And that may relate to food security, to income, and the material perspective, as we're talking about the social relations, connections as well. So how social relations, they develop in the practice of fishing itself, for example. Also cultural reproduction and subjective needs that may be related to beliefs, to social interactions, to culture, to when persons goals for life. And here I'll talk about an example that was a case study that came from this idea of what are the interplays between ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, and coastal communities. And this work was developed throughout the PhD in a community in Brazil. And something that was very interesting and stood out to me was how the canoes play a very important role in connecting people, in bringing together their social relations in different ways, their cultural reproduction, as well as the connections with coastal ecosystem in different ways. Because the canoe, these are wooden canoes, you can see from their shape. So they usually, how they are built is that they go to the forest, they find a specific type of wood that is good to give the canoe a balance and flow in the water. and they have to get the wood in a specific time of the year. They need to understand what type of moisture or like different details of the wood that are related to their local knowledge. And this is passed along generations. And then they carve the canoes themselves, and then they use the canoes to go out fishing. And the fishing, they have a lot of social interactions that you saw in the first picture, that they go out fishing together, they share the catch. They go back to their homes, they produce their food, they go and sell it. So all this has a lot of social interactions. And they have the canoe races as well. So this is a type of a sport or a competition, but also a lot of cultural reproduction, where they go out for the canoe races, they compete, but at the same time they share local food. They talk about, so they say that people from different communities, they get together, so it's a way, an arena where they can discuss relevant issues, for example related to local protected areas. So how can they negotiate their traditional rights with protected areas, how they can integrate or negotiate their fishing grounds with the tourism sector, with oil platforms. So all these canoe races provide also an arena for very important political talks. And this is what I'm going to talk about this in this case study a little bit more. So this was a case study to understand the interplay between well-being and ecosystem services, and now in this presentation trying to draw some connections with this idea of vulnerability to viability in this transition in fishing communities. So this was a case study approach to understand social and ecological dynamics, that you have to set some boundaries to understand. So you identified a community that is still very, that preserves a lot this traditional type of fishing. That fishing is very important. They also have different sorts of livelihoods, but they carry this cultural identity with them. So this is a comprehensive, inclusive, and diverse and dynamic type of case study that we understand the dynamic as a whole, and then we go, okay, what that means in terms of well-being and ecosystem services bundles connections. And then we use that theory, that the theoretical framework and background, to draw and pick up some of the empirical insights from the case studies to depict a little bit more how we can give some nuances to to well-being and ecosystem services dynamics. And then it goes to the research questions. What are these connections? So how people see them benefiting from nature? What are the main sources? What are some of the bundles that emerge from their experience? And how we do that? So we selected a few different methods, mixed methods. So we did some surveys, but also workshops to try to engage people and have like a meaningful discussions on their connections to coastal areas, and also did photo voice. That was a very interesting type of activity where they would go and take pictures and bring the pictures, and we would discuss their pictures, the meaning of the pictures, what that represents to them, what some of the feelings that emerge once they see the pictures or once they are in that situation. So that gives a more nuanced perspective on the subjective dimensions of well-being as well. And these type of work, they are very they connect to different people. So once you go to the field, you need to have your community or previous people that was working there before. So for that, I'm very grateful to the people that I used to work in my master's that also developed some research there previously in the same community. And this was a very important network to get there, talk to people, get to know people. Local leaders also, they talk with the community and decide if these are something that is relevant or not to that specific community. Is this a type of research that is valuable to be conducted there or not? Because this type of research is not only us going there and grabbing information from them, but it's also, is there something that these type of information that comes from them can help them in some ways in their negotiations processes, and also our mentors and colleagues from here to understand how do we connect the theoretical framework to empirical and local type of case studies, and all this discussions that we have with our colleagues that are also doing the same type of work and also dealing with the same discussions in their minds. So theory, practice, how we incorporate them together, is this something meaningful to science as well? So how can we bring all these pieces together? So this is a very collaborative type of work that help us to understand what we are doing at some point and how that can be meaningful for those people that are participating. And the empirical context was a community in the southeast coast of Brazil, in the state of São Paulo, in a city called Ubatuba. And we have three different communities that we went to do field work. So there are three communities by the beach, Puruba, Almada, and Bisinguaba. And the reason why we chose these three communities is because they still preserve a lot of their culture that are connected to nature. So they have their communities placed by the beach, and they also have a very interesting preserved forest around them. So they still have a lot of natural resources that they rely on, mostly on fisheries, but also on local business for tourism, for example, and also with a highway that was being built in the region in the 70s. This has been changing. They have more access to the city now, but still they still preserve their traditional ways of living connected to fisheries. And they're close to each other too, and they interact, for example, in the canoe races. They have a lot of connections in the political arena. Once they need to decide on their traditional grounds, they have to negotiate to preserve their rights to use the forest and the marine areas. So they are very integrated, and they have a social identity. They understand themselves as Kaisara people, and I'll talk a little bit more about that using some pictures. So here is just a photo for you to see that Brazil, we have two main forests, the Amazonian forest on the north, that is this light green area that you can see on the top of the country, and also this darker green area is the Atlantic forest, is the second most important forest in the country. And here on the left, you can see a photo uh, on the on the 1500s, where the Atlantic forest was still very well preserved. And recently, the forest have some reminiscence. And here, between the São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, are very well, maybe the two most famous cities in the country is where Ubatuba is located. Ubatuba is in between these two cities. And you can see that there's still dark green areas here. So the forest is still well preserved in that specific region, even though it is being degraded when you compare it to the original cover of the forest. So because of that, there's many protected areas, many tourism happening in the region, and also different types of economic activity, because São Paulo and Rio are the economic capital, let's put it this way, of the country. So there are different things going on. It's very dynamic, very diverse. And still the traditional people are living there based and relying on fishing. So here is a photo of the communities. You can see here are their houses where they put their fishing gear, the canoe that are sit there in the sand. So many people that live there by the coast. You can see a lot of the forest still well preserved. The photo in the middle is some of the wood that they grab from the forest, and these type of woods, they release a chemical component that helps them to preserve the net. So they put the net inside of this liquid, and with this component from the wood, the net will be more preserved and last longer. And here you can see cassava. Cassava is a type of is it similar to potato? It's different, but similar to a potato. And they use that as one of, they have a local, they plant, they have local agriculture in their backyards, and they still have um, that as a source of livelihood. So sometimes they made flour out of cassava, and then they exchange for fish. So these are very interesting dynamics that are still very well preserved, and is part of the Kaisara culture that they recognize and identify themselves with. And so in this context, we wanted to understand what are some of the core contributions that coastal ecosystems provide to fishing communities. How do the communities perceive these contributions? What are some of the pathways where ecosystems can actually provide well-being to people? And here I put some photos that are outcomes of the photo voice activity, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in the next few slides. So we did some surveys, talked to people, went to the communities, talk who are the people that are still very linked to fishing in different ways, very active in the community, and talked about what are some of the main benefits, what are some of your daily life activities. How do you see yourself perceiving some benefits from nature, or how do you see your interplay with nature? And we conduct this photo voice activity that we ask them to go and take pictures or select some pictures that would reflect their daily life living in this community and how they benefit from that. So they went there in the process, engaging with the photos, and then they bring the photos for us, and we were discussing what is this photo about, what does it represent, why you chose this specific photo, how do you see you integrating with the different type of nature or nature element that is in there. And then they brought these pictures. This is a compilation of some of the pictures, and you can see how the canoes were very present in the picture. So the canoes were a way that they could identify as a symbol to represent their social connection, social relations in the communities. So we have here the first photos, canoe race photos. Also, in the last line here with different canoes in the sand. It's also a canoe race, and how they can come together and discuss about interesting. They also talk about it's very nice when you see your kids going and in the canoes. They learn how to fish. Also, the collaborative process of putting the canoe in the sea, taking the canoe out of the sea because it's a heavy canoe, so you need people and work together. So they really represent a lot of the relational aspect of coastal ecosystems that is represented under the symbol of the canoe. And we have also workshops where we invited people to come and talk about their experience with coastal environment. So what are the main activities that are happening there? How these activities shape their well-being in different ways? How they change their well-being? How they see themselves, like what is being good for them, what is not being good for them, how they see them, how they perceive their material needs being fulfilled, how they perceive their social connections with people, how they perceive themselves within the community living there. And then for that, we did a word cafe type of workshop. So people are sitting different tables. We have some questions they were discussing. Then they're moving around in different tables, discussing with other groups. And in the meantime, we had someone drawing, like putting in a visual format all the discussions that you can see. That these are the three different communities: Almada, Pissinguaba, and Puruba, and the main outcomes. How the discussions, one idea connected to another, and just to have this visual component. And this was left for the communities to use, and was very interesting because two of the communities took this flyer to the schools, and they were discussing with kids how can we that how do you see the Kaisara culture in your generation? So how can you see yourself and your family situated in the fishing communities with the tourism coming? How do you see these changes? So this was a very interesting outcome that was somehow unexpected, but it was very interesting to see how that was something that was fostering these discussions beyond the research as well. And what are some of these contributions? What are some of the ecosystem services that are connected to the well-being of fishing communities? And this is what I want to talk with you now. So here is a summary of the outcomes. What are some of the well-being dimensions that connects to different types of ecosystem services? And what are some of the changes and drivers of changes that are these ecosystem services are dealing with? So we have safety that are really connected to the mountain chains, to the native vegetation, to the river basin dynamics, and they're suffering, for example, with deforestation processes. But on the other hand, protected areas are helping to preserve this native vegetation that are help with safety in the communities in different ways, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We have livelihoods and physical health that are supported by the vegetation as well, by agriculture, by tourism, by fishing, and at the same time are being shaped by protected areas implementing in there, by the increase of tourism that is a new source of livelihood, but at the same time may disturb or compete with some fishing grounds. We have cultural identity that is also very connected mostly with fishing, with canoes, with contemplation of nature, and is also being shaped for some of those drivers of change as well, affecting um, For example, the fish stocks, pollution affecting fish stocks, reduced fish stocks, sense of meaning and belonging. This was also something from the subjective dimensions of well-being that was very important to them. How do you see and perceive your cultural dimensions that are very linked to agriculture practices and exchange, for example, from cassava to fish. Also going out fishing, the performance of fishing itself, the interaction with other people, the contemplation of nature that is part of the fishing process, and finally mental health and life satisfaction. So how uh, the practice of fishing and this integration with other people that you have help with your mental health as well. So these are some of the interesting insights that were brought from this research. And then here is a more detailed way where safety was a key dimension of well-being that was mostly connected to the landscape. So it was very interesting that they pointed out two different types of safety. So safety, they feel safe. Um, Once you talk about safety, this is a remote area, so they're protected by the mountains. For you to reach the community, you have to go up and down the mountains, or you have to go into this narrow route, which is a bit disconnected from the center of the cities. So you don't have much violence. You can trust and leave your house open, which this is a very important thing for a developing country where public safety is an issue. So this is because of the structure of the landscape and being a remote community, you it's the safety there, like public safety is one thing that was highlighted by them. And another dimension of safety was that the vegetation helps with preserving, helps to prevent landslides that could have, and they observe it where there are deforestation process in some areas of the mountain. So where they see deforestation, the vegetation is not there to sustain the land or the mountain. So they observe landslides and they experience that. So because of their experience and observation, they feel safe once they see that the forest is preserved. And this is a very important way to connect to protected areas in the region and negotiate for their traditional grounds, but also they recognize that preserving the vegetation help them in some way so that they are allies of these conservation processes. Another interesting component of it was mental health and life satisfaction. So this photo was an outcome of the photo voice within the community. So this fisherman, they came back from the fisheries and was saying that once he goes out fishing, fishing allows him to see a beautiful view. And then he brought this picture of the sunrise, that fishing is a mental health for him, that it helps him to forget his concerns, negative thoughts, and he can appreciate his time in the sea and see something that if he didn't have to wake up early and go out fishing, he would probably not have that in his daily life, to see the sunrise and appreciate that. So that is really connected to his mental health and life satisfaction, and that relates to the fishing itself. And also he mostly go out fishing with his canoe and brings this contemplation of nature aspect of fishing. And here is a canoe race. You can see that they run in the canoes, but they also have some tents where they have food. They talk about important political dimensions or political negotiations that they have to have with the government, with protected areas, with other types of companies and organizations. And so someone brought this photo to me and was saying that we maintain this old tradition, which is the canoe race, that also includes a lot of dancing or being with friends. So there is the social component to it. They also discuss important issues that are the political dimensions of it. And the canoe race is an event that brings together people from their culture, their Kaisara culture, for different purposes, for having fun, experience the culture, but also discuss important issues for them. And they say that they feel this need, and this is brought through this canoe races event, for example. Here is another photo. So this is a fish drying with salt in the sun. And so for until the 80s, they didn't have electricity in this community, so they used to preserve fish in this way. They don't need most of the houses already have electricity, and uh, they have fridges, and they can preserve the fish in that way. But this is still a practice that brings them the flavor of how it was done before. So it's also connected a little bit with their food and nostalgia, remembrance from uh, different how that they used to do that in the past. And this is something that a fisher brought as a picture, and saying that this is mullet, the fish. That mullet fishing is a family type of fishing in which everyone who helps gets a fair share. So once you help in the fishing process, you get your share. You get your share. And this is what the family of this person represents. That is a lot about sharing, about trusting, about the sense of community. So this brings the social and subjective dimension of well-being that is represented by the mullet fishing for this specific person. And another photo of a canoe that saying that the canoe represents fishing. This was a young person from the community that was saying that the canoe is an object, but this is also a fishing equipment, and it is also represents leisure because they enjoy going out for a canoe ride, for example, or competition from the canoe races. And is the right to come and go. It represents how they have this flexibility. They can take a car or transportation and go to the city, but they could also use the sea and go to the canoes. Actually, this is how they used to do mostly in the past, where the routes were not that good to drive. So they used to go to the city center to get buy things in the supermarket or do other types of activities in the center by the sea. And they say that the canoes is the roots of Kaisara people. And even though they have other means of transportation, this is still something that they can rely on and also represents a lot for them. So this is just a summary, some examples on this interplay between well-being and ecosystem services, how they are being shaped by different drivers of change in the social aspect, environmental issues, and how this can be linked somehow with the governance of coastal areas to incorporate this dynamism of coastal areas. And some of the conclusions of this talk is that how the communities they perceive these contributions, what are the ways that they perceive these contributions, and that could be incorporated into the governance arenas. So they observe. First fact is that once they observe something, for example, once they observe the landslides in areas where they're being deforested to build, for example, parking lots for tourism or houses or other things, they need to address the trade-off. So there's a trade-off in here. We observe this. We have some benefits from tourism. We have some income from there, but we also have more landslides. So what are some of the negotiation that can play into this specific context that will be beneficial to the different sectors? Second, they experience well-being. So once they go out fishing, they experience this sense of uh, enjoyment of that is connected to mental health, that is connected to their enjoyment of life. So it's an experience. Finally, fishing is also an extractive type of activity where you can have product that you can sell or can use for your own nutrition. So this is another type of ways that they perceive well-being. And the visual component to it, once you're there and you're contemplating nature, you can have um, some inputs from a visual input that will bring you happiness or bring you well-being in some levels as well. So these are the ways that people perceive well-being. And as you can see, if you think about fishing or fish as a material type of ecosystem service, this can also be relational or a social or cultural type of ecosystem services that can come from an experience, from an observation, or from extractive ways as well. So this breaks this dichotomy from material and non-material ecosystem services, because one material ecosystem service can also be non-material because this can bring you an experience. So this integrates a little bit how the dynamism of coastal areas can play and could help to with negotiations with other sectors in the decision-making arenas as well. And this helps us to address the vulnerability to viability transition in coastal communities, because once we understand what are the benefits that people gain and what are the benefits that need to be addressed in order to keep them viable. This is something that can help to direct governance perspectives into something that will be beneficial locally, but also take into considerations that these areas are also used by other sectors. So what are some of the trade-offs and negotiations that need to take place in order to address the different interests in coastal areas? So as a quick summary, to understand this transition from vulnerability to viability requires a broad understanding of the context. What are some of the pathways that people can gain well-being from ecosystems, and that will make them willing to negotiate and to have a better sense of how they depend on nature and how that can be useful to address the different activities that happen in coastal areas. And among the multi-dimensions of vulnerability to a viability transition, well-being is a key to untangle the material, relational, subjective aspects of this transition and foster vulnerability to viability transition in small-scale fishing sector, and also to understand the dynamism and dynamic interplay of coastal and people in coastal ecosystems and people in the coastal setting. So thank you, and I'm happy to talk about it, discuss a little bit more, take questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I was smiling the whole way through because it's just such an important topic, and I really appreciated your sort of history lesson on the concepts of ecosystem services and well-being and nature's contribution to people, and the controversies and strengths of those concepts and theories. And then your case study provided such a wonderful deep dive into the real nuance and complexity of the way that people's well-being and coastal environments are so intimately connected. So it was a really enjoyable talk. Thank you so much.